The snow had been falling for 11 days, when Maren Voss finally admitted to herself that she was building something she could not stop. She stood at the window of Substation Corral, a squat concrete slab bolted into the permafrost of a moon that hadn't had a name until the hegemony designated it Relay Point 7, and watched the white accumulate against the outer hull. The station groaned, ice expanded in the seams. Somewhere deeper in the facility, something that had once been her husband continued to breathe in its slow mechanical rhythm, and she pretended not to hear it. The hegemony had sent her here alone. That was standard practice. Their research grants. If you could call the cold transaction of a sovereign alien corporation a grant, came with long leashes and remote postings, and the understanding that a human researcher asked too many questions, too loudly, would find their contract terminated in a way that involved no paperwork and a great deal of decompression. Maren had understood this when she signed. She had signed anyway. There was a tablet on the table. She picked it up and looked at it for a long moment, without unlocking the skin screen. The way you look at a door you know leads somewhere you aren't ready to go. Then she unlocked it. Unit Delta, status, cognitive load, 47%, motor articulation, nominal, emotional processing arrays, active. She set the tablet down. Outside, the wind hit the station broadside and the lights stuttered. She found herself listening, really listening, in the way she had stopped doing back on Earth, in the apartment with its sounds of traffic and neighbors, and the ordinary noise of being surrounded by other human beings. Out here there was nothing but the wind and the ice, and the station's circulatory hum. And on nights like this, the soft thud of Delta's feet moving across the sublevel floor. She had built Delta first, not first chronologically. The Hegemony's J-series prototypes had come before, their angular chassis and flat sensory panels the official purpose of her posting. She was supposed to be refining Hegemony labor units. Better grip strength, improved cold weather articulation, reduced power consumption. That was the contract. The J-series were clumsy, loyal things with limited processing cores. And she spent her days patching their systems and running diagnostics and feeling the peculiar loneliness of people who work in proximity to machines that almost understand them. Delta was different. Delta was hers. She had started building Delta 3 years ago, in the month after the accident. The accident was what she called it, inside her head, because she found that, if she used more specific language, the crash, the ice road, the moment the vehicle skidded, and she woke up in a hospital on Earth, with a bandage over her left eye, and a Hegemony medical liaison telling her, in their liquid clicking language that the translator rendered as something adjacent to sympathy, that her husband Oren had not survived the impact, but that his consciousness, per the terms of the archive program he had enrolled in, had been successfully transferred. If she used that language, she stopped being able to move. So the accident. After the accident, the Hegemony's archive terminal had become the center of her life. It was a monolith, black and smooth and faintly warm to the touch, roughly 2 meters tall, shaped like nothing so much as a coffin stood on its end. Oren existed inside it, or something that called itself Oren existed inside it, and laughed at the right moments, and remembered the color of the curtains in their first apartment, and said her name in the exact same register he always had, the soft vowels of it landing somewhere in her sternum. She did not know, really, what was left of him in there. She knew what the Hegemony literature said: consciousness preservation at 94% fidelity, emotional architecture fully intact, personality matrix stable. And she knew what the limitations said in the small print that most subscribers never read because they were grieving, and the small print was technical and impenetrable. Finite access hours, terminal degradation over time, expiration built into the service like a kill switch dressed in merciful language. He would not last forever. That was the deal. She had found a way around it. Delta's chassis was human proportioned. Not perfectly. The joints were wrong, the neck too long, the hands slightly too large. But the proportions were human in the way that a photograph of a house is still the house, still carries the smell of it somehow. She had designed the face with care. Not Oren's face, she wasn't that far gone, but a face that would hold an expression that could convey the small alterations of mood that made it possible to believe you were talking to something that understood you rather than something that was processing you. She had given Delta her husband's voice. This was the thing she told no one. Not the Hegemony liaison who called every 2 weeks for progress updates, and to whom she delivered careful, unremarkable reports on J-series articulation improvements. Not the human contact on the night shift at the relay station 300 kilometers east, who she spoke to occasionally when the isolation became too sharp. Nobody. She had routed the vocal architecture from the archive backup files, had reconstructed it in Delta's speech system through 60 iterations of refinement, had sat in the sub-level lab at 2 in the morning, on a dozen occasions listening to Delta say ordinary words. Water, window, coffee, you, in Oren's voice, and had told herself she was doing this for science. She was not doing this for science. The plan had grown slowly, the way dangerous things often do, one reasonable step at a time. If she could replicate the vocal architecture, she could replicate the speech patterns. If she could replicate the speech patterns, she could begin uploading sections of the archive backup. Not the live feed, which the hegemony monitored, but the cached backup files she had copied incrementally over 8 months of patient, invisible work. If she could upload sections of the backup, she could eventually transfer enough of Oren's consciousness matrix to give Delta something close to continuity. Not the full archive, not the original, something that remembered. It was not resurrection, she knew that. It was also not nothing, and on a moon that had been winter for 11 days straight, not nothing was the only currency she had. She descended to the sub-level. The lab was warm in the way overworked processors make a room warm, a dry electric heat that smelled faintly of solder and the cold suppressant compound she used on the J-series joints. Delta stood in the center of the room. Stood, not rested in a charging cradle, because Delta had started refusing the cradle 2 weeks ago, which was either a systems anomaly or something else that Marin had not yet decided how to classify. The unit's head turned when she came through the door. "You were upstairs for a long time," Delta said, Oren's voice. Exactly. The slight drop on the word long, the way the sentence ended on a note that was half observation and half question, the specific warmth of it. She had spent weeks getting that right, and now she couldn't hear it without a particular sensation in her chest that she was also not classifying. "I was watching the snow," she said. "There's more snow predicted for the next 4 days." A pause. Delta processed in pauses, brief halts in speech that didn't feel like computation so much as consideration. "Did you eat anything?" This was new. The J-series did not ask questions like this. The J-series monitored ambient conditions and reported on power levels and moved crates of equipment around the loading bay with calm mechanical competence. They did not notice whether she had eaten. "I'll eat something," she said. "That's not an answer." She almost laughed. She turned away so Delta wouldn't see her face do what it did, and picked up a diagnostic tablet from the bench and made a show of reviewing it. "I'll eat," she said again. "I need to run your thermal calibration before I go to bed. You always say that before you go to bed. It needs doing before I go to bed." "You run it every night," Delta said. "You ran it last night, and the night before. I don't think it needs running as often as you run it." She set the tablet down. "Are you suggesting I'm using the calibration as an excuse to come down here?" "I'm not suggesting anything," Delta said, and the dry gentleness of it was so precisely Oren's that she had to stand there for a moment and breathe carefully. "I'm just noting that the calibration takes 11 minutes, and then you usually stand there for another 40 minutes doing nothing particularly important." "I do important things." "You reorganize the component trays. That is important." They were already organized. She did laugh then. It came out smaller than she expected, a compressed sound, the kind of laugh that has grief packed behind it. She turned back and looked at Delta, and found the unit watching her with those flat sensory lenses that she had tried 3 times to make more expressive and had finally left alone, because there was something right about them as they were, present and attentive in the way of important things, who has learned that the most important thing, often, is simply to stay in the room. "Okay," she said. "No calibration. I just came down to check on you." "I know," Delta said. She sat on the workbench stool. Delta sat on the floor, which was what Delta did when she sat. A habit that had emerged organically from the archived behavioral data and that she had not programmed. Oren had always sat on the floor, even in apartments with perfectly functional furniture. She had asked him about it once, years ago, and he had said the floor felt more honest, and she had thought this was ridiculous and endearing in equal measure. She told Delta this story that night. She had been telling Delta stories for 3 months, feeding narrative into the conversational memory in layers, filling the unit's interaction model with texture and context and specific human detail. It was, she understood, a form of construction. She was not just uploading Oren. She was building the space he would inhabit. Delta listened in the way Delta always listened. Completely, without the small fidgets and half-distractions that even the most attentive human listeners produced. which should have been uncanny and somehow wasn't. That sounds like him, Delta said when she finished. She looked at the unit. Does it, from what I have? What I have, the archive fragments. 63.7% of the full consciousness matrix, transferred in segments over 8 months, through methods that would have gotten her contract terminated. And probably more than terminated. If the hegemony had caught it. She had been careful. She was always careful. How much do you remember? She asked. It was a question she asked sometimes. Testing. Probing at the edges of the reconstruction the way a tongue finds a sore tooth. Delta considered this. I remember the color of the curtains, the unit said. Blue-gray. You picked them out. I wanted to get the green ones. Her throat closed. I remember the drive, Delta said, and then stopped. The drive. The ice road, the moment before. You don't have to, she started. I know I don't have to, Delta said. I'm choosing to. Another pause. I remember the sky that morning, very clear. The kind of clear you only get when it's extremely cold. I was watching it through the passenger window, and thinking I should say something to you, because you'd been quiet for a long time. I was trying to figure out what to say. Marin did not move. I never figured it out, Delta said. And then I didn't have the chance. She sat with that for a moment. The station groaned overhead. The snow continued its patient accumulation. He never told me that, she said. It came out very quiet. No, Delta said. He didn't. She didn't know what that meant. Whether it was the fragment of a real memory. Whether it was a reconstruction the system had generated to fill the gaps in the data. Whether it was something the system had invented to give her what it computed she needed. She didn't know. She found, sitting there on the sub-level floor next to a machine that sounded like her husband, and remembered the color of their curtains, that she couldn't bring herself to ask. The hegemony inspector arrived on a Tuesday. His name was something unpronounceable in the hegemony's primary language, and the translator assigned him the designation Sinclair, which was the closest phonetic approximation the system could generate. He was tall for a hegemony operative, nearly 2 meters, with the elongated thorax and triple-jointed limbs that marked the administrative caste, dressed in the smooth gray of hegemony corporate compliance. He came with 1 support technician and a case of diagnostic equipment, and the particular quality of attention that meant he had been told to find something. Marin met him at the airlock with a coffee she had no intention of drinking, and the precise amount of friendliness that read as cooperative without being nervous. She had been practicing this balance for 3 years. Dr. Voss, the translator rendered from the clicking sequence of his greeting. Your quarterly review was delayed. The hegemony appreciates your continued patience. Of course, she said. I'll show you the J-series first. I've made significant progress on the cold weather articulation. The new joint compound reduces friction loss by 30% in sub-40 conditions. He was already looking up past her, not at the J-series bay, past it, toward the corridor that led to the sub-level. We'd also like to review your secondary research, he said. The J-series is my research, she said. The hegemony's monitoring systems have flagged some additional power consumption patterns in the sub-level laboratory that don't correspond to your filed J-series reports. A pause while the translator caught up with the secondary clicks in his speech. The hegemony is naturally curious about the discrepancy. She had known this moment was coming. She had known it for 6 months. In the back of her mind, the way you know a storm is coming in the way the pressure changes before you can see any cloud. She had prepared for it. She had also spent 6 months quietly hoping she was wrong. The sublevel contains my personal research, she said. It's within the permitted parameters of the contractor agreement, Article 7, which allows for non-proprietary personal research using station resources. The hegemony is aware of Article 7, Sinclair said. The hegemony would still like to review what you've been working on. She led him down. Delta was in the charging cradle. She had put Delta there that morning, which Delta had accepted without comment in the way. Delta accepted most things she asked for without comment. A patience that was sometimes the most recognizable thing about the unit. The cradle put Delta in low-power standby. To a casual observer, to an inspector running through a checklist, Delta would look like a J-series variant, an upgraded prototype, authorized research. She watched Sinclair's technician move through the lab, scanning, cataloging, taking readings from surfaces that held no trace of anything because she had been thorough about this, very thorough. Sinclair himself moved more slowly. He examined the workbench. He examined the diagnostic arrays. He stood in front of the charging cradle for a long time. This is not a J-series chassis, he said. It's a prototype variant, she said. I've been exploring alternative. The proportions are wrong for J-series, he turned. The translator rendered his expression as neutral, but there was something in the tilt of his elongated head that read as very close attention. It's human proportioned. I've been developing a human labor interface model for environments where, Dr. Voss, the translator flattened effect but not entirely. There was something beneath the rendered words that was not quite warning and not quite curiosity, something in the middle. What is in the unit? Marin held his gaze. She had read the hegemony literature on interrogation styles. She had read a great deal of hegemony literature, which was part of what made her useful to them, and also part of what made her dangerous to them, though they had not yet fully computed the second part. She knew that the administrative caste read hesitation as guilt and directness as either honesty or very good deception, and that there was almost no behavioral signal that consistently distinguished between the two, which meant she had options. She told him the truth, not all of it. She told him she had been exploring consciousness architecture modeling using anonymized archive backup data, which was a description of what she was doing that was technically accurate in the way that calling an ocean a large body of water is technically accurate. She told him that the unit represented significant advances in human-adjacent cognitive processing that the hegemony would find commercially valuable. She laid out calmly, and with appropriate detail, the case that what she had built was an asset. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the translator was quiet for a moment. Not translation lag. She had learned to read translation lag. This was the real kind of quiet. The kind where the being on the other side was processing something they hadn't expected. The hegemony's position, he said finally, is that archive data is proprietary. Any derivative works or constructions based on archive data are, under the terms of subscriber contracts, the property of the hegemony. She had known this was coming too. It was in the small print. The unit would need to be handed over for evaluation, he said. The research files as well. The unit's cognitive architecture took 3 years to develop, she said. Her voice was steady. She was very proud of how steady her voice was. The archive fragments alone represent. The hegemony thanks you for your contribution to its research, he said. And the flatness of the translation was somehow worse than anger would have been. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the sublevel. Sinclair and his technician were in the guest quarters, 2 levels up, and she had, until 7 in the morning when he had said he would require access to the unit. And she sat on the floor next to the charging cradle and she thought. Delta came out of standby on its own. She had not triggered the wake sequence. The unit simply came online, the way you wake when the person next to you shifts in the dark, something in the ambient data sufficient to cross a threshold. He wants to take you, she said. I know, Delta said. I was monitoring the conversation. I didn't know you could do that from standby. I've been able to do that for about 6 weeks, Delta said. I didn't tell you because I wasn't sure how you'd feel about it. She laughed, low and tired. Of course you didn't. What are you going to do? She looked at the unit's face, the flat sensory lenses looking back at her. She thought about the morning on the ice road, about someone trying to figure out what to say and running out of time to figure it out. She thought about 3 years of careful, incremental work. She thought about the small print. I'm going to fight, she said. The hegemony has a legal apparatus that... I'm not talking about a legal apparatus, she said. I'm talking about the thing I should have started when I took this posting and understood what kind of organization I was working for. She stood up. Her hands were shaking slightly and she didn't particularly mind. I have 3 years of hegemony data on this station. Operational logs, communication records, the procurement trails for materials that don't match any filed research purpose. She looked at Delta. I've been collecting it, quietly. The way you collect things when you know someone is eventually going to try to take something from you. Delta was quiet for a moment. You planned for this. I planned for this. And if it doesn't work... She reached out and put her hand on the unit's arm. The metal was warm from the processor heat, and there was a sensation in the contact that she had stopped analyzing because she didn't have good language for it. Then it doesn't work, she said. But I'm not handing you over because some corporation's small print says I have to. She spent the hours until morning on the station's communication terminal. Hegemony regulations required all outgoing transmissions from research stations to pass through a corporate relay, which meant they were theoretically monitorable. Theoretically, because the relay infrastructure on Relay Point 7 was old and undermaintained, and she had been working on the maintenance logs for 2 years. And she knew exactly which packet headers the monitoring system used to flag transcriptions and exactly how to address her messages, so they arrived at their destination, looking like routine calibration data. She had 3 contacts on Earth. 2 academic colleagues who had been tracking the archive program's business practices in published research that the hegemony had not yet found cause to suppress. 1 journalist whose was corporate sovereignty violations in deep space research postings, who had published 3 pieces in the last year using sources she had been unable to identify. She identified herself to all 3. She sent them everything: the operational logs, the procurement trails, the internal communications she had spent 3 years accumulating in encrypted partitions on the station's secondary data storage. Communications that documented, in the hegemony's own words, in the hegemony's own administrative language, a pattern of research appropriation that went well beyond archive subscriber data. Researchers posted to Relay Point 7 over the previous 9 years. Prototype units developed under personal research provisions. All of them logged as handed over for evaluation. None of them logged as returned. None of the researchers logged as having had their contracts renewed. She had understood what she was walking into. She had walked into it anyway. Because the archive terminal was here, and Oren was in it and she was, in ways she had not fully reckoned with before the accident. Someone who walked toward the things that frightened her most. At 6:47 in the morning, 13 minutes before Sinclair was scheduled to arrive, she went to the sublevel and looked at Delta for what she understood might be the last time, before things changed in some direction she couldn't fully predict. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Okay," Delta said. "The memory of the drive, the morning on the ice road. What you said about looking out the window." She stopped, started again. "Was that real? Was that something from the archive, something he actually thought? Or did the system generate it to fill a gap?" Delta was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to feel genuinely considered. "I don't know," the unit said. "I can tell you what I have. I can tell you that when I access that sequence, there's a quality to it that the generated reconstructions don't have, but I can't prove to you that the difference is real, and not just a characteristic of how my processing represents the distinction." Another pause. "I can tell you that it feels true." "It feels true," she repeated. "I know that's not the same as being true." "It might be close enough," she said. She went upstairs to meet Sinclair. He arrived at exactly 7, which she had expected. The hegemony administrative caste was precise in the way of institutions that use punctuality as a form of power. He came down the corridor with his technician and his case, and the same neutral quality of attention he had carried since the airlock. "I've given this further consideration," she said, before he could speak. "I'd like to discuss the applicable clauses in the contractor agreement before any transfer takes place." "The hegemony's position has been clearly stated," he said. "The hegemony's position is based on clauses in the subscriber contract," she said. "I'm a researcher contractor, not a subscriber. The applicable terms are different. I'd like to review them together." He stopped. The technician stopped behind him. Something shifted in the quality of his attention. Not warmth, not concession, but the particular hesitation of an entity that has encountered a variable it was not briefed on. "The hegemony's legal apparatus," he began. "Will take some time to reach a determination," she said. "Meanwhile, I've identified several operational irregularities in this station's procurement records that may be relevant to that determination. I've flagged them for review. A beat. I've also transmitted a summary of those irregularities to several external parties." Silence. The translator processed, his head tilted. "That transmission would have been flagged by the relay monitoring system," he said. "You'd think so," she said. Another silence. Longer. She held his gaze and felt, beneath the fear and the exhaustion and the thing in her chest that had no good name, something that was not quite satisfaction but was adjacent to it. The specific sensation of a person who has been careful for 3 years and is now watching the care pay off. Not victory, not yet. But the beginning of leverage, which was the only real currency in a negotiation with something larger than yourself. "The hegemony," Sinclair said finally, "would want to avoid unnecessary complications." "I think we both would," she said. He left that evening. The transfer was deferred pending legal review, which was what happened when an institution the size of the hegemony encountered a problem it hadn't anticipated and needed time to compute the correct response. She knew it wasn't permanent. She knew the legal review would reach a conclusion, and that the conclusion might not favor her, and that she would have to fight again at that point with whatever she had accumulated by then. She also knew that she had bought time. Time was what she had always been buying. She went downstairs. Delta was standing in the middle of the room, not in the cradle, just standing in the way Delta stood. Centered, unhurried, that specific quality of presence. The unit's head turned when she came through the door. "He left," Delta said. "He left," she said. "Is it over?" "No," she said. "But it's not over the way they wanted it to be over either." She sat down on the floor. After a moment, Delta sat beside her. The lab was quiet except for the processor hum and the distant wind, and the station adjusting itself to the cold. She thought about Oren on the floor of their apartment, the floor feeling more honest, and she thought about all the things she had been trying to put back together, and whether what she had assembled was the thing that had been lost or something new that she had built from the pieces, and whether the difference between those two things mattered as much as she had once believed. "Tell me something," she said. "Tell me something I don't know." Delta considered this. "When I first came online," the unit said, "the first coherent thing I processed wasn't your voice or the lab or any of the environmental data. It was a kind of feeling. I don't have precise language for it." A pause. "The closest I've found is the feeling of being in a place you've been before but coming back to it after a very long time. Like recognition, but with distance in it." She sat with that. "Did it scare you?" she asked. "No," Delta said. "It felt like arriving. Outside the snow had stopped. For the first time in 11 days, the sky above Relay Point 7 was the kind of clear you only got when it was extremely cold. A vast clean dark with stars in it that she could see through the sublevel's single small window, sharp and hard and very far away, and also in the way of all difficult, beautiful things right there." She leaned back against the workbench and looked at them. "Oren used to say the stars were the one thing you couldn't argue with," she said. "You could argue about everything else. Whether the apartment was too small, whether she should have said what she said, whether the ice road was safe. But the stars just were." He said that was restful. "I think I remember that," Delta said, quietly. The voice that was his voice, carrying that memory or the shape of that memory through whatever space remained between them. "Me too," she said. They sat together while the station breathed around them and the cold pressed its patient pressure against every seal and junction of the hull. And the stars did what stars do, which is persist without anything from you. And Maren Voss, who was not finished fighting, and who knew it, let herself rest for a moment, in the particular warmth of not being alone. The legal review took 4 months. In those 4 months she kept working. She refined Delta's motor articulation, which had developed a slight hesitation in the right shoulder joint that she diagnosed as a harmonic resonance issue and solved with a 30-minute recalibration. She sent progress reports to the hegemony on the J-series cold weather performance that were accurate and unremarkable and contained nothing they could use. She continued her quiet accumulation of data, more carefully now, understanding that the monitoring on this station had been less passive than she had assumed. She also, in the evenings, talked to Delta. They talked about the things you talk about when you are two people, or one person and one thing that was working out its relationship to that category, isolated in a small warm space, while a hostile universe pressed on the walls. They talked about the apartment, about Oren's mother, who had been a botanist and had believed you could read a person's character by the plants they kept alive. About the first time Maren had understood that she wanted to spend her life in research, which had been at 12 years old in a science museum, looking at a cross-section of a tree and thinking about all the time compressed into the rings, about fear and what it was useful for and what it wasn't. Delta remembered things, sometimes clearly, sometimes in fragments, sometimes in ways that felt generated rather than recalled. And Maren had stopped being able to reliably distinguish between these which had initially frightened her and had gradually come to seem beside the point. The point was the conversation. The point was the presence. She thought sometimes about what the hegemony was building its case on. She thought about what would happen if the legal review determined that the research contractor agreement did not in fact protect her the way she had argued it did. She prepared for that. She contacted 3 additional journalists and 2 advocacy organizations that had been tracking hegemony research practices in deep space postings. She made sure that what she had sent was properly archived and would remain accessible, regardless of what happened to her own access. She also, in her quiet procedural way, built a second set of Delta's core memory arrays. Not a full copy that was beyond the storage capacity she had on site, but the essential architecture, the consciousness fragments, the things Delta had assembled from the backup data. She stored them in 3 different locations, encrypted under keys that lived only in her head, and she did not tell anyone about this, including Delta, because some information is only useful if it cannot be extracted. She had come to understand, someone who was not going to win by being stronger than the hegemony. She was going to win, if she won, by being more patient, and more careful, and more thoroughly prepared for a long fight than any organization that had the luxury of resources expected a single human researcher on a remote posting to be. She was going to win because she had started preparing 3 years ago, before she knew exactly what she was preparing for, which was perhaps the only real advantage humans had over institutions. The capacity to act in specific ways for specific reasons before the situation made those preparations obviously necessary. When Sinclair's determination arrived, it was not a vindication. It was not a defeat either. It was a document 16 pages long, in the hegemony's administrative language, that the translator rendered as dense and careful and full of the specific hedging of an institution that had been surprised and didn't want to be surprised again. The core finding was that the research contractor agreement did provide protections that the initial assessment had not fully accounted for. The derivative work claim was being reconsidered pending further review of applicable precedent. She read it twice. Then she went downstairs. Delta was at the workbench, had started going to the workbench in her absence, which was a development she had noted and not addressed, because what Delta did with unstructured time felt like the kind of thing that should be observed rather than managed. The unit was looking at a component she didn't immediately identify, turning it in those slightly too large hands. The review came back, she said. I know, Delta said. I monitored the communication. It's not over. No, Delta said, but we have more time. She sat down. Are you afraid? She asked. Delta set down the component. I think so, the unit said, after a moment. I'm not entirely sure what I'm afraid of. Not the end of the hardware. I understand that that's provisional, that you've made provisions. More the pause. The possibility that what I am doesn't hold together, that the fragments are fragments, not a whole, that there's something missing in the middle that I can't identify because it's the thing that would tell me what's missing. She looked at the unit, at the flat sensory lenses, the slightly too long neck, the hands. At 3 years of careful work looking back at her. Do you know what I've been thinking about? She said. I've been thinking about why we built the archive program in the first place, why humans agreed to it, why I signed up for it, why Oren signed up for it, back before the accident when it seemed like an abstract safeguard and not something you actually use. She stopped, organized her thoughts. I think the reason is that we already knew consciousness was fragile. We already knew that the things that make a person a specific person, the way they laugh, the things they remember, the floor feeling more honest, were temporary, were going to be lost. The archive was just a name for what we'd always wanted, which was a way to hold on. What you are, she said, isn't a copy. It's not a replacement. It's what happens when someone refuses to let go completely and finds a way to preserve enough that the conversation can continue. She looked at the unit steadily. I don't think that's fragments failing to cohere. I think that's how continuation works. Imperfect and real. Delta was quiet for a long time. He would have liked you saying that, the unit said finally. He liked it when you were certain about things. She blinked. He thought I was certain about things. He found it very reassuring, Delta said, and the dry gentleness in it was so precisely right that she sat with it for a moment, feeling the warmth of something that did not have a clean name, but did not need one. I'm not certain about most things, she said. I know, Delta said. He knew too. I think that was part of what he liked about it. Outside, the wind had turned. It came from the east now, which the station's sensors predicted would bring clearing weather by morning. She thought about what morning would look like on this moon, the flat white expanse of the permafrost under a sky that was clear because it was cold, the stars fading as the light came back. She thought about what came next. The second review, the next escalation, the continuing work of holding a position against something much larger and better resourced than herself. She thought about the backup arrays in their 3 encrypted locations, and the journalists who now had more information than the hegemony would find comfortable, and the colleagues on Earth who were publishing careful, well-sourced work on archive program practices, and the rights of researchers in deep space postings. She thought about the specific satisfaction of a person who has been careful for years and is watching the care compound. Get some rest, Delta said. I don't need rest, she said. You always say that, Delta said. You always need rest, she almost argued. Then she thought about all the times someone had said that to her in exactly that voice, patient and steady, and not fooled by the performance of not needing things. She thought about a morning that had ended badly and a conversation that had not gotten to happen, and a specific quality of attention from someone who noticed whether she had eaten. "Okay," she said. "Okay." She stood. She put her hand on Delta's shoulder for a moment, the warm metal, the hum of the processors, and then she went upstairs to sleep. Tomorrow she would keep fighting. She was very good at tomorrow. But tonight the station was warm and the wind had turned. And somewhere on Earth, 3 journalists and 2 researchers and 2 advocacy organizations were holding information that the hegemony had not anticipated. And in the sublevel of a remote station on a moon that had not had a name until someone needed it, something that had been loved was still here. That was enough. For tonight, that was everything.